This program is brought to you by the Georgia Neurosurgical Institute. For over 50 years, rendering neurosurgical care to patients of all social conditions, treating complicated problems involving the brain, spine, spinal cord, and peripheral nerves, endeavoring to encourage quality care, medical research, innovation, and education on a local, national, and international basis.
Good evening. My name is Joe Sam Robinson. It's my pleasure to have with us Mr. Buck Melton, Dr. Buck Melton. Welcome, Buck. We've had you here lots. We have lots of good interchanges.
Solving the problems of the world.
Yes, and we've made reference to the Constitution about different, quandaries the country faces. And there's been one recently about the idea of government supervision and you could say eavesdropping or attempting to ferret out terrorism in regards to the Patriot Act, and now we have the Freedom Act, if I can understand that correctly. Yes. What are the issues that are playing out in this particular discussion?
Well, as you know, the Patriot Act was passed, or the USA Patriot Act was passed bipartisan in the wake of September 11th. And it was a concern to civil libertarians because it did give the feds more power to conduct surveillance, to conduct unsupervised surveillance, and it really, I won't say backfired, but it was misused from the beginning because it was really aimed at counterterrorism. But most of what happened under the Patriot Act for the following 10 or 12 years was really aimed at something that wasn't terroristic, domestic drug activity, domestic criminal activity. And then, of course, the Snowden revelations of a couple of years ago showed that the feds were collecting all sorts of metadata, of phone data. They claimed they were not listening in on phone conversations, but they could see who was calling whom. And this bothered people sufficiently that Congress did allow some of the more controversial Patriot Act provisions to sunset. Now, not everybody thinks that's a good idea, so there's been a press on, especially from some Republican quarters, to reenact those, but Rand Paul and others managed to shut that down. Instead, we've gotten what I suppose you could call a compromise measure this week, the USA Freedom Act, which is going to allow the government to collect that data, but now it's going to have to go before courts and get more judicial supervision. So,
do the names of these acts disturb you any?
A great deal. Yes.
It's like saying the Motherhood or Protection of Small Children Act.
Yes.
I mean, so the Patriot Act. I mean, that's pretty. Who would be against freedom? Who would be against patriotism?
Apple pie and mom.
I mean, so I'm not sure I like. It sounds like a little trickery using those terms of phrase, and it's a little trickery. And I mean, the American people are watching this circumstances.
Yes.
What about a more realistic name? I mean, I could think of anything that's a better name that really reflects what's going on. The Information Harvest Act or the Counterterrorism Act. Why not call it the Counterterrorism Act? That sounds more realistic.
There have been some people who have said that these high-profile laws, not just in this area but in others, the names almost always lie about what these things are about.
Well, it cheapens things, doesn't it?
Yes,
if you're calling freedom is a pretty big deal, and I mean, what you could say only indirectly. Does this information harvest have anything to do with your personal freedom? In fact, you could imagine, you could, I guess, philosophically bounce the basketball a little bit here, but in general, it should restrain freedom a little bit. You'd feel like you weren't quite free in your communications. So it's kind of an anti-freedom act in a way.
It is, and of course, the idea of freedom. We Americans have very definite ideas of what the word freedom means, and perhaps other philosophical or political traditions have a very different concept. I think the Nazis probably had a notion of freedom to be the Übermensch you always have been, or to be free to be a member of the master race. That's a Hegelian concept that's totally out of place.
If I get this right, Freiheit, right?
Yes.
That means freedom, I think, in German. Freiheit. I give myself a gold star for blundering into that. So. But that was actually Hitler.
Yes.
That was one of his slogans,
Yes.
freedom. So
Yes.
he's saying freedom, it was a Nazi
makes free,
slogan.
yes.
Yes. Or by Mike Fry.
Mike Fry, yes.
Mike Fry, I think. That's whatever, Auschwitz. But the takeaway message is that freedom is kind of an interesting kind of commodity. It means a lot of things to different people.
Yes.
It's not a well-defined word.
Yes.
The government has sort of usurped it. It ought to be real careful when it uses it. It ought to be very, discreet in it. Well, all right, we've assaulted the terminology, but having said that, the actual act that's out there's a little bit of collision between what people think the government should know and not know. And it seems to me one of the problems is that do people trust the government? Do they trust the intelligence agencies to be their protectors or their abusers? And there's a lot of issues there. I mean, supposedly Congress is supposed to be watching this. Do they effectively watch what's going on? Since everything is secret,
Yes.
since the information they're obtaining is secret, since they're telling you one thing, is it correct what they're telling us?
Well, as the viewers know from if they've been watching me and have managed to continue to stung at me after all these years, I tend to have a dim view overall of politicians and especially congressmen, simply because they have to try so hard to keep their positions that I think it is, and I'm not slamming particular congressmen, I'm slamming the whole idea of where representative government has brought us to. But it becomes a very self-serving thing. So they tell you what will help keep them in office or help get them reelected, and I'm being very cynical about that, but I think there's at least a grain of truth in that. Add to that the fact that if you're on an intelligence oversight committee, the question of how many other committee appointments do you have, how much of your time and effort can you put into your oversight duties. Then there is the more sinister question of what are the intelligence contacts telling the oversight committees and what are they not telling them. So
here's another side.
Yes.
Here's another side of the story. I mean, you could say, well, we can't trust the intelligence agencies. We can't trust the politicians that are telling us this is the correct thing to do. But on the other side of the street, you could say Ron Paul, for instance, is saying, oh, this is bad, don't
Yes.
do this. And does that play into some kind of American neuroses? A little, was it Richard Hofstadter's The Paranoid Style in American?
Yes.
Did I throw you a
Very
softball
good.
there?
No, that's a good one, the paranoid style, and that was coming out of the McCarthy era.
Right, so the idea
and he
is,
almost ruined his reputation by doing that.
You mean Hofstadter?
Hofstadter,
yeah,
yes.
right. He was a Columbia professor or
Yes,
some very
yes.
and wrote a famous book on the subject, saying that one of the things that was sort of, part of American character was this an irrational paranoia that somebody was after you, the communists were next door, or the government was going to spy on you. Maybe more so here than other countries, and there are
Yes.
lots of reasons for that. So are we paranoid, as Professor Hofstadter would say, and is this something to worry about, or should we trust the government? I mean, what are your comments on that?
Well, I'm not sure that we have the type of paranoia today that Hofstadter was talking about. I think you can probably trace it back to about 130, 120 years ago, when you see the new wave of Central and Eastern European immigration coming in with radically different ethnic groups than what we had traditionally seen. And not just the ethnic groups themselves, but the philosophies that were really alien to the Anglo-American traditions, anarchism, socialism, Marxism, and sometimes these philosophies would have violent outbursts. The assassination of William McKinley by an anarchist in 1901, the Red Scare immediately following World War I and the Bolshevik Revolution, the better known Red Scare of the McCarthy years, and the knowledge after 1949 that the Soviet Union has a means of literally destroying the United States, that for the first time in our history, the oceans did not protect us anymore. And you see at that point, Americans no longer as a group being as interested in traditional liberties and getting more concerned with security.
And fearing other people or change or
Yes.
I mean I won't ever kill this, but the invasion of the body snatchers, and I get that right?
Absolutely.
Which is a tremendous movie about it was in the early 1950s, and
Yes.
the idea is that you really can't trust anyone, that
Yes.
actually the people that are next door to you are aliens,
Yes.
and they're going to take your soul over
Yes.
and turn you into a big vegetable or whatever
The
they do.
Manchurian Candidate is another
Yes,
one. Yes.
and The Day the Earth Stood Still. I mean, we can
Yes.
name a number of this Hollywood genre out there,
Yes.
which in a subtle way was, these are sort of leftist viewpoints, it was a subtle way of of striking at the McCarthy, or at least playing on to the paranoia of that period.
Yes.
But all right, let's talk about paranoia, concern, security. You mentioned the Soviet Union, 1949, they dominated the world, they could destroy the world. Well, we have all around us terrorist comments here. We have 9/11, that certainly took place.
Yes.
And episodically, we hear about the underwear bomber. We hear about people that are coming in shooting up places. And there's a sense of paranoia in a way, isn't there, about the dangers that the American citizens face. Somebody's going to blow the plane up. When you get an airplane, they have to be checked. Who knows what's going to happen? Every day there's a fear ISIS is going to do something, somebody's going to do something.
Yes.
And the government is putting in substantial, I guess you could say, a substantial protection apparatus. And the question is, number one, is it constitutionally legal? Number two, how effective it is? And number three, who's watching the watchers?
Yes,
Who's
always a
looking after
problem.
the watchers?
Always a problem. Well, yes, that's a huge can of worms that would take a long time to unpack. My own view is it's I'd suppose a combination of cynicism and fatalism. That ever since the Industrial Revolution and we got steam power, that our machinery, our industry, our industrial capabilities, both mechanical and chemical, have greatly increased abilities to do a lot of damage. And as an example of this, and you might know this better than I, but how many people in America die in automobile accidents every year? And how many have been dying for 50 or 60 years in that fashion? And then compare that to the number of Americans who have been involved in terrorist incidents. And yet, I think a lot of it is the media's fault. We've always heard if it bleeds, it leads. I have a saying, good news is no news. It's
Yes.
always good to cover the Boston bombing or whatever. And so it's ramping up people. It is getting them afraid of something that ultimately we really cannot protect against. Now, if a hostile state,
Yes.
ISIS, were to get a dirty
Right,
bomb
right,
or a
right,
nuclear
right.
weapon, obviously the ability to cause mass destruction on a huge scale would be a very bad thing. But individual deaths, as tragic as they are for the individuals and the families of the individuals involved, statistically almost do not move the meter. And in trying to protect against them, you cannot guard every target. It's impossible. So what do you do?
So, can people manipulate other people on the basis of fear? If one need to say it that way. I was recollecting French history around the 1789 or so, the Great Fear.
Yes.
So fear has been out there, and
Yes.
often people, politicians particularly, usurp rights. They take power with the idea of placating people that are frightened. And
Yes.
are people unnecessarily being frightened, I guess is the question. And are we being unnecessarily frightened?
Unnecessarily is I think too strong a word there, but I think the danger from terrorism needs to be put into perspective. And as I believe it was Edward R. Murrow, the great journalist Murrow, who said during the McCarthy years at one point, we need to remember that we are not descended from fearful men, that it took real gamblers and tough people to make that voyage 200, 300, 400 years ago across the Atlantic, and that a certain amount of risk and a certain amount of danger is just built into life. So the question is not, is there a terrorist threat? It is, how great is the terrorist threat, and how much should we sacrifice of our traditional liberties to try to deal with that?
Is there the sense of absence of personal power to resist this terror? So, we could say, well, yes, our forebears came, from wherever they came from. It certainly took a certain amount of guts to show up here. But people, they were on their rural farms, they were armed or whatever, and so the things they confronted were something they could respond to. But if you're just, poison gas is going to come upon you in the subway, you have no power to respond to the plague, if you want to say it that way. It's like a plague in the Middle Ages.
Yes.
A mysterious evil descends upon you,
Yes.
and you don't understand exactly how the evil got there, or even why it's there.
Yes.
And it's so terrible. There's nothing you can do about it, and you don't rest easy.
Well, I think what happened to the I forget the flight number of the plane that went down in Pennsylvania on September 11th. I think that's an interesting microcosm of this problem that you talk about. Obviously, statistically, you're much safer on a commercial airline than you are on I-75.
Yes, yes.
But people feel out of control. You're strapped into this chair, into this tube that you can't leave.
Right.
And if something happens to it, you ride it down in flames. And for many years, when the hijacking really got to be a serious problem starting in the early 70s, my understanding is that flight crews, passengers were all told, just do what the hijackers say, and that minimizes the danger. Well, if you listen to the recordings and all the information we have, the September 11th hijackers were saying the same things. Just don't try anything and you'll all be fine. Well, that was a blatant lie.
Yes.
And you saw the passengers in the Pennsylvania airplane take charge of their own destinies, that we are not going to sit here calmly, we're going to go down fighting.
Yes.
So I think that's a great metaphor for what we are doing in the terrorist years now. Do we sit there and take it and sit there in fear, or do we try to reassert control and take some charge of our lives even at increased risk?
Yes. Well, I think those are very valid points. Just going back a little bit to the Freedom Act and what's the compromises that have been there.
Yes.
So supposedly the government, I don't quite understand this exactly, but there is some kind of oversight. There's a judicial oversight that exists in the Patriot Act.
Yes.
That has been just almost non-existent.
Yes.
It's just a pro forma judicial oversight. And
Yes.
as I understand it, it's like you get one search warrant for the whole country. One
Yes.
judge can say, well, you can search anybody in the country you want. Now you have a search warrant, and it's not what you'd imagine would be the appropriate use of that legal device.
Well, the Fourth Amendment requires a particular description of what is to be sought or to be seized, and I do not see a blanket warrant like that as being particular enough, but I'm not the one who's interpreting it. In the USA Freedom Act, my understanding is that the judicial oversight, while increased, is still going to be rather nominal, because a lot of it is going to be through the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act court, that top secret court that's been around since the 1980s that I've mentioned before, that you have to have a top secret clearance to practice law in front of, and that is notorious for not turning down warrant requests.
Yes.
The statistics I've seen are just amazing. That like 25,000 warrant requests, the court has nixed about 4 of them.
Yes.
So I don't see that there's a great deal more oversight.
To me, it would be useful. If people, I'm always disturbed when we don't get appropriate information here as American citizens. Our forebears imagined that we'd have whatever freedom means.
Yes.
Part of the word freedom would be that people could not arbitrarily impinge on our lives. So the government, I think that's a fair definition of it, and the government is presumably putting themselves in the position to do that. And if we're going to make that sacrifice, you'd like to imagine that we're going to get some kind of results out of it. So if this act has been present for almost 15 years, what good has come of it? What good has come of that? If I can ask that question. And the story is that there have been 2 hijackings were stopped by passengers.
Yes.
The passengers saw something was amiss, and they just by themselves, as good Americanos, just took action and overcame the desperados.
Yes.
but all of the infrastructure in place, all the government, I guess you could say, information aggregation, we ought at least hear that 7,000 things have been stopped. We don't hear a word, nothing,
Yes.
not a scintilla of information about, not even a hint of what's happened.
Well, I have been slamming the intelligence community pretty badly tonight, but I will go into the other side here. That you can't. It's akin to the idea that you can't prove a negative. That maybe this surveillance has in fact stopped a lot of plots in embryo that the intelligence community cannot divulge without handicapping itself in the future. So
we could hear something. We could say 3,000 people have been arrested. There are 164 separate incidences that our mechanism has averted, or whatever. 74 plots have been discovered last month, some number like that.
Yes.
And a politician that people, I don't know if there can be such a creature, but a politician that the American people repose confidence in says, I can't tell you this because I give away these secrets, but if you trust me, I'm your guy up here or your lady up here. I believe all this stuff. 77 things have been helped, and were this not here, my guess would be 7,000 people would have died last month, or some kind of thing. Well, that would reassure me. But we don't hear even that.
Yes. Well, some of these plots are perhaps we catch them so early in embryo that who knows how they could have developed.
We got to hear
it's
how many. Well, how many were there? 70 or 100, or how many people were arrested? 3,000 people arrested. I mean, something.
It's a hard thing.
We don't get anything, do we?
Perhaps there's some though who were assassinated in violation of American law, so they couldn't tell us that.
Well, is it? I guess
Yes.
we could just to go along those lines. We really haven't had anything terrible that's happened in the U.S. in the past 15 years related to any kind of terrorist events, with these ongoing wars underway, with the U.S. really enmeshed in several overseas wars and blowing people up and killing people and doing this and doing that, maybe for good reason, but in the middle of warfare, and with sympathizers in this country of our opponents in the war, and nothing has happened. So something, I mean, can
Yes.
we name anything that's occurred much here? I mean, not too much. I mean, the Boston Marathon. I
Yes,
mean,
the Fort Hood shooting, which is an oddball. So.
some strange things like people came to Texas, they tried to shoot some people.
Yes.
I mean, or occasionally we have some kind of sort of lone wolf person out
Yes,
there.
which would be a Fort Hood example. So, on the other hand, you could flip it around, and how many casual violations of personal privacy or Fourth Amendment rights have there been? The Transportation Security Administration, for instance, rough handling passengers, colonoscopy bags, all sorts of things like this. I mean, how many indignities should innocent American people be submitted to in order to keep the rest of us safe?
Let's ask this question. I mean, it recently came out that the screeners at the airport, was the I don't know what you'd call those people, the screeners, they're the national, whatever they are.
Yes.
But they tried to see how effective they were at stopping things, and it turns out very ineffective, and a 96% failure rate.
Yes.
And yet everybody pretty much goes through the take your shoes off, whatever, stand in line for 15 minutes. But it's reassuring, isn't it? I mean, it diminishes fear. I mean, if you go through that, well, I can feel comfortable now. Everybody's been checked out.
But there's the idea that this is nothing more than security theater. You have a false sense of security. You may feel perfectly safe, but it's just a feeling, and the fact is there are huge gaps in the system, and you're still just as much at risk as you ever were.
But nothing has happened. So I mean, if it's an ineffective system, and maybe the terrorists believe, well, the system is functional. So having said
Deterrent
that,
factor, yes.
having said that, was it a good idea to just make public the idea that it was an effective system? I mean, is that, if it was stopping people from doing things?
Yes. Once again, how do you prove what you've stopped? Let's
Yes.
say I'm a crazy terrorist. I feel like bombing a plane, but then I think, but gee, since I couldn't possibly get through their detectors or they'd shoot me at the gate, I'd better not try.
Right.
Then there'll be absolutely no forensic or hard evidence of
Yes.
the fact that that my plot has been foiled just by the system.
Right.
So how do you measure that?
You know, this problem would appear to be going on for a long time, would it not? I mean, you could say if you could say enemies of the country that are out there, I mean, there seem to be legion. The enemies never seem to decrease.
People will never stop hating America, and the destructive power of weapons continues to increase as their availability does as well. I was reading today about someone who used a 3D printer to construct a receiver for an AR-15 rifle. So far, completely legally, it's completely unregistered, undetected, and works just as well as an AR-15 that you buy off the shelf.
So we have a lot of fear factors out there.
Yes.
So we're all interdependent. We're all sort of, our lives are not particularly under our control. We're in big mass subways. We're in big cars, airplanes. We're moving along. Our water we drink comes from wherever. We depend on this or that. So we're sort of at the mercy of anything that disrupts that system. And at the same time, it appears the United States, even though it's isolated by these oceans and we have our own sort of tremendous geographical sphere here, we seem to be enmeshed everywhere with everybody. And everybody tends to hate us. And because we have pretty much an open border country here, people that hate us can easily get in the country, can they not? I mean, they can just easily come in here legally.
Yes.
They don't have to sneak over the border.
Well, even if the people can't, the ideas certainly can. Look at the number of young radicalized individuals who've been stopped on their way out of the country to join ISIS.
Yes.
Or going again to Fort Hood, a U.S. Army officer, for Pete's sake. How do you stop it? Our traditional defense has always been that free and open debate, to take on the erroneous or dangerous ideas, to bring light to them, to talk people out of the problems. But then, of course, what if you have people who are actually mentally unstable and cannot be reasoned with? What do you do in a circumstance of that sort?
Or even to put it in a finer point here, can you truly be rational? I mean, you can make the case you're always under some kind, well, not always, but frequently, people are under, sane people are under emotional distress. Some person that's very sane and normal and is very upset, maybe he sees his home country being bombed and he just becomes furious and something can happen. We have such an international population here that it would appear that many people would want to do something. And you mentioned the mental illness issue. We have a lot of people that are disturbed, that have access to just random shootings. In Denver, someone goes in the movie theater and shoots everybody. Just random acts to mentally disturb people.
And in the name of civil liberties and due process, it has become much harder over the last 40 or 45 years to commit people against their will, even when it's obvious that there is some sort of mental problem there. And what do you do with that?
Well, maybe it should be re-examined.
Yes.
I mean, I think it is possible to be more definite about psychological disturbances. I think we can do tests that show abnormal neurotransmitters, and I mean, it would be reasonable to me that if someone can be proven to have substantial psychosis that can be documented with reproducible studies, that it's no favor to the person not to treat the person, but the psychosis needs to be appropriately treated.
Yes.
It would be reasonable, in my opinion, just to take that step.
This brings us back to where we started, the interests of the individual, the freedom and liberties of the individual versus the need of the community for stability and security. Where do you draw the line?
Well, it appears the courts attempt to do that, do they not?
Yes, an ongoing struggle.
And just in the last 30 seconds, which way do you think the courts are going to go on this? Which side are they going to come down on? You have 15 seconds.
Oh, I think there's a trend towards less freedom and autonomy and more towards security in the long run, and that is something that concerns me.
Well, thank you so much again
for
a great conversation, Bucky.
Indeed.
Thank you for coming. Thank you.
This program is brought to you by the Georgia Neurosurgical Institute. For over 50 years, rendering neurosurgical care to patients of all social conditions, treating complicated problems involving the brain, spine, spinal cord, and peripheral nerves, endeavoring to encourage quality care, medical research, innovation, and education on a local, national, and international basis.